In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was worshipped as a living god and owned, in theory, every single grain of sand in his kingdom. And by the end of this video, you will see that a single institution quietly owned more of Egypt than he did. This is the ladder of the Egyptian New Kingdom, farmer to god king, paid not in coin, since Egypt used none, but in something far more literal: grain, beer, and bread. Because at every rank of ancient Egypt, there was a ration, a measure of grain, a share of the harvest, and behind every measure, a life that history rarely bothers to weigh. Today we climb it, rung by rung: the farmer, the tomb builder, the scribe, the vizier, the pharaoh, and then we open the books on the institution that quietly out-owned the god king himself. We start at the very bottom, in the mud of the Nile itself. This is rank and ledger. In today's episode, Ancient Egypt, rank by rank. What each life was worth in grain, what that ration actually bought, and who really controlled the wealth of the Nile. We start on the black soil of the Nile with the men whose sweat actually fed the entire kingdom. One thing before we climb. If you want to see who really gets paid in worlds like this, empires, armies, ancient kingdoms, subscribe now and leave a like. It genuinely decides whether this channel survives. A farmer along the Nile did not own his land outright. Most of it belonged on paper to the pharaoh, the temples, or the nobility, and the farmer worked it as a tenant, handing over a share of every single harvest. That share could reach as much as half of everything he grew. And when his harvest fell short, that shortfall did not disappear. It became a debt pool carried forward with interest into the following year. Tax officials, known as scribes of the granary, physically measured every field before harvest with a knotted cord to calculate the exact yield the state expected. There was no hiding a good year and no mercy for a bad one. And the farmer's obligation was not only grain. During the months when the Nile flooded his fields and farming was impossible, the state simply conscripted him for labor instead, on canals, on temples, on royal monuments. There was no version of the year in which he was not, in some way, working for someone above him. Here is your first question, and answer it honestly in the comments below. If half your harvest and your entire flood season belonged to the state before you ever saw a single grain of it, would you still call yourself a free man? Tell me below. One rung up from that mud lived men who traded that same hard labor for something the farmer never got: real skill, real status, and eventually, real leverage. One rung up in a walled village built specifically to house them lived men whose entire job was building the pharaoh's eternal home. And they made history in a way none of them could have known at the time. In the walled village of Deir el-Medina, skilled craftsmen carved and painted the tombs of the pharaohs themselves. They were paid in grain rations roughly 3 times what an ordinary field laborer earned, plus fish, vegetables, and even wine on festival days. 3 times a farmer's pay was a genuinely privileged life in this world. A real house in a planned village, servants of their own in some cases, and a status that passed proudly from father to son. Letters and receipts that survive from this village show ordinary workers borrowing tools from each other, trading beer for bread, and taking each other to a local court over unpaid debts. It was a small functioning economy, tucked entirely inside the machinery of a much larger one. Letters and receipts that survive from this village show ordinary workers borrowing tools from each other, trading beer for bread, and even taking each other to a local court over unpaid debts. It was a small functioning economy, tucked entirely inside the machinery of a much larger one. But privilege still depended entirely on the state actually paying on time. And in the 29th year of the Pharaoh Ramesses III, around 1158 BC, the grain simply did not arrive. So the workers did something no one in Egypt had ever recorded before. They put down their tools, walked out of the village, and sat down inside the grounds of a royal mortuary temple, refusing to leave until they were paid. It is the first labor strike in recorded human history. It worked. Officials scrambled, grain was found, and the men were eventually paid what they were owed. 3,100 years before the modern labor movement had a name, these craftsmen had already discovered its most basic weapon: simply stop working. It would not be the only time. Records show the workers of this same village striking again more than once in the years that followed, always over the same grievance. The state had learned a lesson about withholding pay from the men who built its God's eternal homes, and then, it seems, quietly forgot it. And if you think a strike over grain rations was dramatic, wait until you see what one single institution above the throne itself was quietly getting away with. It would not be the only time. Records show the workers of this same village striking again more than once in the years that followed, each time over the same grievance. The state had learned a valuable lesson about withholding pay from the men who built its God's eternal homes, and then, it seems, quietly forgot it. That leverage over the state was nothing compared to what a single skill could buy the rank above the builders entirely. One rung above the builders sat the men who could actually read what was owed to everyone else. Literacy in ancient Egypt was rare, held by perhaps 1% of the entire population. A scribe who could read and write hieroglyphs, and the faster hieratic script held one of the few genuine paths of upward mobility in this entire society. A scribe recorded harvests, taxes, temple inventories, and the wages of everyone beneath him on this very ladder. And remarkably, his own earnings were exempt from the taxes he spent his whole career calculating for everyone else. An old piece of Egyptian wisdom, taught to boys entering scribal school, put it bluntly. Be a scribe, it said, for the scribe is spared all manual labor. It was, quite literally, the ancient world's advice to get an education and avoid working with your hands. A skilled scribe could rise out of his own family's poverty entirely within a single generation, entering royal service or temple administration. Of every rank on this ladder, the scribes was the only one a clever landless boy could realistically climb on merit alone. A skilled scribe could rise out of his own family's poverty entirely within a single generation, entering royal service, temple administration, or even, for the most brilliant, the Vizier's own office. Of every rank on this ladder, the scribes was the only one a clever landless boy could actually climb on merit alone. Here is your second question for the comments. In a world where literacy alone could exempt you from both taxes and hard labor, was reading and writing simply a skill? Or was it the single greatest cheat code in ancient Egyptian society? Tell me below. Above every scribe in Egypt sat one man who wielded that same leverage over the whole kingdom at once. Above every scribe in the land stood one man who answered only to the Pharaoh himself. The Vizier ran the day-to-day machinery of the entire kingdom. Taxation, justice, construction projects, the granaries, all of it passed across his desk before it ever reached the Pharaoh's attention. His wealth was measured in land grants, servants, and a tomb built to a standard just below royalty itself. But it was also measured in exhaustion. Egyptian texts describe the Vizier's working day beginning before dawn and ending only when the Pharaoh finally released him. One surviving Egyptian text describes the Vizier's office bluntly. It is not sweet, it says, being an official. He rises early, works late, and is blamed for everything that goes wrong beneath him, whether the fault was ever truly his. Pause the video here and guess. If a mere scribe could be exempt from taxes and a vizier could command the entire economy, what fraction of Egypt's actual farmland do you think the temples alone controlled at their peak? Type your guess in the comments before I tell you. I will wait, because above the Vizier stands the Pharaoh himself, and his own fortune is about to make everyone below him look almost poor. Locked in your guess? Because above the Vizier sat only one man, and the answer to that question is about to make even his power look modest. The Pharaoh was worshipped as a living god, and his personal wealth was staggering. Vast estates across the kingdom, tribute from conquered lands, and above all, gold flowing north from the mines of Nubia. So much of it that Egypt's neighbors openly called it the land where gold was as common as dust. Everything in Egypt, in theory, belonged to him. Every field, every temple, every ounce of that Nubian gold. On paper, there was no wealthier or more powerful rank in the ancient world. And every pharaoh, no matter how divine his title, needed the temples to publicly bless his reign and crown his heirs, legitimizing his rule to a population that took religion as seriously as taxation. A god-king still needed his priests to say so out loud. Some of the greatest pharaohs understood this danger and tried to break it. One ruler even attempted to abolish the old gods entirely and worship a single sun disk instead, stripping the temples of their land in one stroke. Within a generation of his death, the old priesthoods simply reversed it all and grew back stronger than before. And yet even the pharaoh could not simply spend that wealth however he pleased. Tradition, priestly approval, and the enormous cost of maintaining temples, armies, and his own eternal tomb quietly limited what even a living god could do with a fortune that was, on paper, entirely his. But theory and temple ledgers, it turns out, were about to disagree rather sharply, because the true fortune of Egypt was never really sitting on the throne. Here is your answer. By the height of the New Kingdom, the temples of the god Amun alone are estimated to have controlled close to a third of all of Egypt's cultivated farmland. 2/3 of every temple estate in the entire country belonged to Amun specifically. The Temple of Amun at Karnak controlled roughly 90% of Egypt's ships, thousands of laborers, its own granaries, and effective command of the state's agricultural taxes across millions of acres. It was, in every practical sense, the largest corporation the ancient world had ever seen. Its warehouses stored grain reserves large enough to feed the kingdom through a famine year, giving the temple genuine power over life and death in a bad harvest, power that in practice rivaled anything the pharaoh's own granaries could offer. And the man who ran it, the high priest of Amun, controlled tax collection across that land, directed thousands of artisans, and managed state grain reserves that gave him more day-to-day economic leverage than almost anyone in the kingdom, including, at times, the pharaoh who supposedly owned it all. In the centuries that followed, that imbalance only grew louder. Toward the very end of the New Kingdom, the high priests of Amun at Thebes effectively ruled southern Egypt in their own right, while a weakened pharaoh's line held the north. The god king's ladder had, in practice, split in two. So here is the final ledger of ancient Egypt. The farmer surrendered half his harvest and his entire flood season, and never once saw it as a choice. The tomb builder earned 3 times that farmer's ration and still had to strike simply to be paid on time. The scribe read and wrote his way out of both labor and tax. The vizier ran an empire and slept less than any of them. The pharaoh owned everything on paper. And the temple of one single god ended up controlling nearly 1/3 of the whole kingdom in practice. Even in a kingdom ruled by a living god, the ledger found a way to place someone quietly above him. 3,000 years later, that is still the single most reliable law in every world we climb on this channel. So here is your last question, and it is the one that matters most. If even a living god could be quietly out-owned by the institution built to serve him, does real power ever actually sit on the throne? Or does it always just work in the room next door? Tell me below. I read every comment. Next time on Rank and Ledger, we climb one of 2 ladders and you decide which, the CIA or a hedge fund. Vote in the comments. And if this story held you, do the 2 things that keep this channel climbing. Leave a like and subscribe. The ladder continues.